Hybrid Cloud Show, Episode 14. I'm Aaron.
I'm Gary.
I'm Sean.
And I'm Shane.
Welcome to the show about public cloud, private cloud, and everything in between. Our views here are ours and not those of our employers. Colin, who's one of our patrons, wrote in to say, I live in Denver, Colorado, and the large cloud providers don't have data centers here. Can you touch on the smaller cloud providers and their feasibility? For example, Shark Tech is one I see in my search results the most.
Before we dig into the specific cloud providers, I think this got my wheels turning when I saw this question. It's a really good one. I wanted to talk more about some of the actions someone might take when they have a constraint on them that says, I need to use a less well-known cloud provider. Let's take an example of you're in North Korea and you need to pick a local cloud provider. So obviously the big 3 or 4 aren't really available to you. And to me, this gets to a point where the decision bubbles up to like a company level risk reward type of call. Like lots of people choose GCP, AWS, etc., because everyone's kind of placed that bet. And so I have high confidence that this cloud provider will likely meet my reliability or usage needs just based on the market. And you're also aware of like some of the limitations are probably very publicly discussed, or some of the failures that have happened, like edge cases have been poked at, right? Like we talked about the issue with the S3 bucket, having API calls against it and just charging someone for unauthorized access. So you're not going to get maybe that level of visibility with a smaller cloud provider. And that kind of struck a chord with me. You just have more unknowns. Are we thinking about like different disaster recovery scenarios? Like, I don't know, if the cloud provider goes out of business, we'll say, is that now a risk we need to worry about? And if that's the case, how long does it take to reverse that decision? How expensive is that? Do you need to hire a bunch of highly paid consultants to try to fix this very quickly? Can your business suffer an outage for a week if that's the case? And if so, then you get into like business survival continuity risks. You get into considering something far more vendor agnostic as a very reasonable approach to take. So those are the things spinning in my brain. But is there other things we should be thinking about when you're not using those big 3 and you can't say, AWS has gone down, but half the internet's gone down, so my reputation's all right because I can just blame AWS. No one's going to care if your little cloud provider's gone down, but your competitor's still up because they're on some more popular provider.
I guess another thing to think about is how well does that cloud provider manage its resources or manage its hardware? So, I mean, OVH, for example, are a bigger cloud provider, right? But if we look back 5 or 6 years, they had that big incident where they had an entire data center catch fire. And it was multiple availability zones because it was effectively just a load of servers in a shipping container somewhere or something. So even with some of the better known cloud providers, you do get into stuff like that. I guess the thing I would question here as a step back is, why do you need a cloud provider that is based in Denver, Colorado? I know that in the US, connectivity isn't maybe as ubiquitous as it is in Europe, certainly fast connectivity for residential homes, and Sean is sighing away in the background here.
Sad face.
Yeah.
Do you not have gigabit there?
No way. And my upload's like 20.
I would say I feel sorry for you, but it's just quite funny at this point, isn't it? But do you really need a data center in Colorado, right? I get 10 millisecond pings across to the physical box that I have, and that's in France, which is a different country. If latency and bandwidth aren't a concern, and you're just running web apps or something, maybe you could host those a little bit further away. There's plenty of the larger cloud providers and even the smaller ones that have got presence in places close to Colorado. So I guess I would evaluate what your specific requirements are there. Is it some kind of regulatory reason that you need to have that? So does a regulator say that you need to put a workload in a certain data center, for example? So I've worked with customers in the past where they have to have a proportion of their workload in a certain data center in a certain city so that a regulator can go and physically look at the servers and touch them and unplug them if they broke some kind of law. If it's that, I guess that's fair enough. And at that point, you sort of are locked into random data center in Denver. Or if it is something that you're concerned about as regards latency, maybe just try it in somewhere a little bit further away that is maybe a little bit more reputable than something that you would be closer to.
I used to work in a company that did hosting and cloud provided services at a small boutique sort of scale. and we had some algo traders who were using our platforms. And that's interesting because they care about being next to the exchanges, but they're not quite the high-frequency trader kind of people where, the latency is extremely important. But once you start talking to those financial data centers and the sort of mechanisms people have to ensure that everything is fair in those trading places, it is quite funny with cross connects that all have to be the same length, and they have fast paths that go between London and Frankfurt, I think it was, where you can pay for the slow path, which is just a giant roll of fiber optic cable so that it slows it down a bit compared to the more expensive path that goes through the tunnel a bit quicker. And some of that stuff matters, right? In those spaces, latency does matter to be worth real money. But in terms of people just getting workloads done and then getting the results back, in most cases, I don't think you're going to see it in the same way.
Yeah, well, it's interesting, right? Because there are clearly a bunch of edge cases where latency or data residency or whatever really does matter. But we're talking about for the 95% of use cases where it doesn't matter, I'd maybe seriously consider whether you do need a data center that's in Denver.
I'm going to put my architect hat on here because this seems very peculiar to me. When I was working at a smaller cloud provider, we had use cases like this, and that's where like the edge, right? Edge computing came into play, where you needed to have your data residency in one location or your private cloud or wherever that is. And what we would do is we would deploy closer, right? So if we don't have a data center in Denver, right, we could deploy somewhere in another data center or on the edge on Verizon's network, get what we need there so they have the low latency. But the data doesn't live there in Denver. The data lives in the private cloud or in their other data center back home. So maybe the question here is, how do you evaluate smaller providers? But then it gets back to the point of, are you sure you really need one?
I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with using a small provider, though. I think for the makeup of the market, it's great that there are other players than just the big guys. So I'm not against the idea of having a small cloud provider. And I think that if it meets your requirements, because what you need is met by a small local provider and you want to support a small local business and maybe you want to go in and meet the people, that's great, actually. I think there's some real benefits to that. And they might treat you an awful lot better because your business matters a lot more to them than it would to a giant multinational company. So I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with it. There might be some sort of edge pieces like, depending on size. If you're talking even Linode size, then it'll have its own Terraform provider, for example, and maybe Shark Tech doesn't. I don't know. It didn't look like it from a very quick Google. So there's some things like that where you might find there's differences, but in terms of normal login, get a VM kind of stuff, if that's all of the service you're using, then maybe it doesn't matter if the price performance is better than you can get elsewhere. I remember once we looked at a data center in Iceland, which is one of those good examples of latency not mattering for a bunch of workloads. And the value proposition there, as I understand it, was that in Iceland, it basically stays at good server temperature year round. And so they can just open the windows rather than doing expensive cooling. And they have a whole lot of geothermal power as well, which makes power there very cheap. I think there were probably some good deals in terms of the government helping fiber providers and things get in there as well to kickstart the whole thing. But the end result is that there's quite a lot of data center stuff happening in Iceland. And we looked at that quite seriously because the deal was quite good and we had some workloads that didn't really matter in terms of latency.
I think this really comes down to evaluating what your business cares about. That's the important thing. If your leadership is saying we need to have a local data center, let them know that is not a simple, we'll just swap AWS out for local cloud provider. That comes with costs that you will probably have to take the burden on and pay. So letting them know that, hey, maybe not rewriting everything to be vendor agnostic is worth the effort when it could just be slightly uncomfortable legal conversation.
Yeah, and I think for me, you always present those things as here's what we do if we do need to do that. Here's what we do if we don't need to do that. Here's what happens if we do nothing. And just present them with the trade-offs. And ultimately, those decisions are often not yours to make as an individual contributor or as an architect. If you have a legal requirement or a requirement that comes from a customer to put something in a data center, often you just have to evaluate, is this a contract we want? If it is, then we just have to present the overlords with the information that we have.
I don't know much about Shark Tech, but if you're talking about a local data center, I'd also be very careful with that because you often will want more than one data center. So if you're then going to have to go and find a backup data center or a data center for your HA workloads where you can fail over to them, then you need to solve that problem too. And that will probably not be the same place that you put your primary workloads if you're doing it right.
There are also cloud providers that specialize in having a lot of physical presences, like Equinix. They have a location in Denver. You could use them, and they're relatively big.
Yeah, and I think the other thing to bear in mind there, particularly for HA or DR, is that terms that cloud providers use, like availability zone or whatever, don't always mean the same thing. Sometimes an availability domain is a different room in the same data center or a different rack in the same hall. Other times, it's a completely different data center that is 100 miles away. And you have to really, really dig into these things. Don't just assume that availability zone means availability zone or redundant storage means redundant storage, because they really aren't created equal.
I think that's true of the big three cloud providers as well. So just do that for small or big and everyone in between, to be honest.
Yeah, absolutely. Just know what you're getting into. I run a bunch of stuff in the very data center that OVH had burned down. But I also know that there's nothing critical there and that I could spin it up elsewhere if I needed to. And I've got copies of the data. So for me, that's fine because I'm paying £20 a month for a fairly beefy dual Xeon box.
I guess maybe getting a little bit back to Colin's question, have any of you deployed like heavyweight production workloads on smaller cloud providers? How did that look and what tools did you use to kind of like interact with that? I'm guessing there's no elegant API to deal with these things.
How small is small, I guess.
Yeah.
I mean, I've deployed a bunch of production stuff on DigitalOcean, but that was just small edge caching boxes, effectively running an Nginx reverse proxy with some local caching stuff in there. And it was fine. We needed some closer points of presence to cache some images. We could get some boxes from DigitalOcean for $10 a month, and it was fine. Smaller than that, I haven't really gone. But for DigitalOcean, it was very much Terraform, Ansible, fairly similar stack to what I would have used when we were deploying our larger production stuff on Azure at that time.
I'm very conscious of that meme from Scooby-Doo where there's a person with a ghost outfit on and it just says DigitalOcean and then you pull the thing off and it's just AWS underneath. Is that still true? Is DigitalOcean just AWS?
DigitalOcean is 100% not on AWS, but a lot of resellers for other services are. For example, a common one that I see is Vercel. Vercel is a huge front-end oriented provider that lets you do quick stand-up of your front-end application, but then, they're just running it on AWS and they charge you 500%.
Heroku, Databricks, Elastic, insert other SaaS product here.
Yeah.
A lot of them are just running on the big cloud providers.
Well, and further down the stack too, like a lot of cloud providers are buying colo facilities and you're buying fiber from somebody else. Like everybody's got pieces that go into their puzzle. So long as you're getting what you need out of the level that you're buying, then I don't think that them being resold is a huge problem unless they don't know what it is that they're selling. I know that it used to be a real problem in the stack around fiber because it can be quite difficult to understand your fiber routes and making sure that your resilience is what you think it is when you're buying resilient fiber connectivity. And so you need people who understand enough about fiber to make sure that the routes are actually resilient going into your data center or whatever. But I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with reselling unless they don't have good control over their stack.
As long as they're transparent about it and it is adding some value. If it's not adding any value, then of course I should just go direct to the vendor, right? But something like Heroku is an entire platform as a service obfuscation on top of AWS. So for a lot of customers, that's really worth it. If it's something like they're buying a VPS from DigitalOcean for $5 and reselling it for $8, then maybe it's not quite so worth it.
Benedict writes, I recently started a new job at a place that has quite a few workloads running in the cloud on Kubernetes and making heavy use of infrastructure as code and automation. It's a lot to take in, but we're also thinking about taking steps to increase security and implement some best practices. Since none of us has a dedicated InfoSec background, I was wondering if you might have advice on how to go about such an endeavor, where to start, or resources that helped you in that regard. Now, I think we've covered some of these points before in terms of where to start with cloud security and those sorts of pieces. But do people have things to add around the infrastructure as code or the Kubernetes pieces in particular?
IAC exists for a reason. It's because what you have there in your repo is your infrastructure. So I think that'd be the first step. Learn whatever your IAC is, Terraform, Pulumi, whatever, and then start seeing how it's laid out and start understanding how all those pieces go together. I think that's the first step there, to understand your infrastructure, and then you can figure out how the automations connect to each other.
In terms of the infrastructure as a code piece, are there particular security concerns there that are worth mentioning? If you're using infrastructure as code, but you don't know much about security, things to be aware of.
I guess the big one is state and secrets management. So make sure you're storing secrets securely, ideally putting them in some kind of secrets management service or using Vault or something if you're using Terraform. It's always a good place to start. And then with state files, there sometimes is sensitive things that are stored in state, whether you like it or not. So making sure that they're stored somewhere securely, put them in S3 or preferably put them in some kind of encrypted DynamoDB table is always good. Don't store those alongside the actual code itself.
Even before we start talking technologies, like if you've not got anyone with any InfoSec background, I mean, that's okay. But if no one's got much experience in security, you might be going in the opposite direction to what you think you're doing. You might be adding more complexity and not really actually applying the right principles. So I definitely have a look at some of the basics, like OWASP 10 even is worth reviewing just to think about this a bit more. And I mean, if you can, like, try get maybe a consultant in to give you a bit of a direction as well, because this is quite again, we always answer it depends, but it's quite context specific. So very much depends on your business. So for something as serious as this, I would try get some outside help as well if you can.
I think one of the interesting things you said there, Shane, was complexity. And if you haven't got anyone from an InfoSec background and you're not entirely sure how the stack is fitting together, maybe evaluate if you even need to use something as complex as Kubernetes. Maybe you want to look for some kind of slightly more managed platform as a service, something like Fargate or Azure Container Service, where some of those things that you would have to do in a Kubernetes world, like patching worker nodes or making new AMIs or things like that, are obfuscated away from you. And you're just worrying about building a container on a known good, secure, updated base image, or making sure that you're using supply chains that are actually trustworthy. If you're a small team and you don't have dedicated InfoSec, actually you can go a long way by reducing the number of things that you have to manage and look after. And I know we often talk about Kubernetes and say that it's really great, and it is almost a sledgehammer to crack a nut in some cases. If you're a small team, try and keep it really, really simple and straightforward and reduce the number of things that you're having to worry about in that security chain.
It's a really good point. Like, if you can reduce that complexity and leverage more of what the cloud providers are offering, like maybe be a little more aligned to an AWS or an Azure, and then get some free image scanning or something like that might get you some free benefits as well.
And ultimately, your deployable unit still ends up being a container, right? So if you wanted to pick that up when your company grew and move it to a Kubernetes or move it back on-prem, or even simplify further and just run that on a Linux box on a VPS, it's absolutely something you could do.
It sounds like they already have workloads running on Kubernetes right now. So what can we suggest to them about transitioning from Kubernetes to something more simpler?
I guess it depends what the workload is. It's really difficult to say. If they've already tied themselves into a bunch of stuff that only Kubernetes can provide, then that's going to be really difficult. If it's a Docker container running some kind of web endpoint or API, it's probably a lot easier to migrate that. So without knowing too much about what the workloads are, I guess it's a little bit more difficult to suggest what an appropriate platform might be to run it on.
And there's a spectrum about how much your Kubernetes is managed for you as well. So it might be that there are ways that you can give up some of the responsibility of looking after your Kubernetes as well, if that's helpful from a security perspective. We don't always think that the managed Kubernetes out there are doing the absolute best job they could in terms of keeping everything secure. But if you're going into it without a specialist hat on, then there's a good chance that one of the big providers is going to do a better job than you might if it's not something you know an awful lot about.
Yeah, and I guess there's also a lot more than just the Kubernetes piece here, right? We've touched on a lot of this before, but making sure that you're using all of the tooling your cloud provider gives you in order to understand what your security posture is really valuable. I know in the AWS world, there is things like Trusted Advisor, which is going to do that high level, what the security level of the infrastructure is. There's the container scanning in the container registry that Shane mentioned earlier. And there's also a bunch of stuff like the well-architected framework, maybe just looking through what the questions are in the security pillar of that and just thinking about those kind of questions with the lens of your workload applied over them is quite often really valuable just to get you thinking in a bit more of a security-focused mindset about the way that things operate.
Guard duty for EKS is a thing. So if you're in the AWS ecosystem, you can get security issue scanning for like pods and clusters and nodes. So that might be a kind of cheap way to get something started as well, to get some visibility into potential security events.
Depending on how far back you want to go in terms of the security of this stuff, if you're using containerized applications, making sure you have a good understanding of what's going into those containers and keeping the applications and the security pieces of those containers up to date is crucial too. So a lot of the mistakes I see made are around people not keeping the operating system inside the container up to date and having a good story around regenerating those containers when there's a security update to the dependencies that are underneath their application. And so if you don't have a good story for that, then running it on top of anything is going to be problematic.
It's all really defense in depth stuff, isn't it? If you can secure everything from the outer layer by putting something like a WAF or some kind of CDN in front of there, secure the container itself, understand what that container is made up of, and then do a reasonable job of securing the infrastructure that's running that container, that goes a long way to stopping a good percentage of attacks and removing some of the attack surface that might otherwise be there if you weren't considering it at all.
A final note I'll say, Benedict, is that somebody thought of all these decisions as they were making them, and it might not be completely transparent to you. So check the documentation. And if it's not there and it's not transparent or easily identifiable, please write it down for your sake and your future teammates.
I guess to re-emphasize what we said, there are a whole bunch of things that you and your non-InfoSec-minded team could do in order to help the situation. And I would recommend at least doing the things that we've said. But at the end of the day, security should be, and often isn't, job zero. So if you're really not sure and you really don't have a degree of confidence in the security of the platform you've built or the workloads, then genuinely do consider getting some outside help. Even if it's just someone coming in for a couple of days to evaluate things, it's going to pay dividends in the long run.
And document it all, please.
Yeah, and also get that person to document everything.
Thanks to Colin and Benedict for writing in with those questions. If you've got questions, please do send them in to show@hybridcloudshow.com. Thanks also to our patrons. If you'd like to join those people, you can at hybridcloudshow.com/support, where for various amounts on Patreon, you can get an ad-free feed of either this show or all the Late Night Linux family shows. And sometimes you receive episodes early. We'll be back in 2 weeks. Until then, I've been Aaron.
I've been Gary.
I've been Sean.
And I've been Shane.
See you later.